It was never pleasant to lie on the wet spot, and even less so when you were alone. A creaking sound awakened Sean Lovett, and when he opened his eyes, he screamed. The sky was falling, and his life flashed before his eyes. Oh, my God! Stark naked, Sean jumped up, narrowly escaping the torrent of water pouring from a huge hole over his bed. Booming thunder and lightning shook the over 100-year-old 5-story building he lived in, while rain and hail pelted the windows. The howl of the wind from the opening in the roof made it hard to concentrate, but from the amount of water spilling into the small studio he'd lived in for the past 3 years, Sean knew he only had a few minutes to grab whatever he could shove into his backpack and a slightly damp overnight bag. He pulled on a t-shirt and stepped into boxers and jeans. God, everything he owned was in this small space, but he remembered to save the most important thing, the picture of himself and his sister. That and his laptop were all he was able to manage. The rest was a wash, literally. Alarms blared, and Sean heard people yelling from downstairs, "Fire! There's a fire in the basement! Get out!" After shoving his feet into mismatched flip-flops, he ran out the door, closing it just as the entire building swayed on its crippled frame. Well, I'm sure as hell not coming home anytime soon. 3 days later, Sean sat in his sister's bright yellow kitchen, sipping coffee, trying to figure out how to politely get out of hell. Now, he loved Charlotte, make no mistake. She and her husband Ray were nice enough to take him in like the stray he was after his building had collapsed like a wet deck of cards the night of the worst storm to hit the East Coast in 10 years. He'd arrived on their doorstep in the early dawn, shivering and soaked through. The Red Cross had offered shelter to everyone, but after a hasty text to one of his friends who didn't answer, he'd called Charlotte to tell her what happened. Of course, she'd insisted he come stay with them. Ray was some hotshot executive for an international bank and traveled extensively. At the moment, he was on a business trip to London, and when Sean showed up, Charlotte was grateful for his company. They had a big house on Long Island with plenty of room. Plenty of room was relative, because Charlotte and Ray had a little boy, Carlo, who was 6, and twin girls Julia and Fiona, who were turning 3 soon. In other words, a zoo. Charlotte's reassurance that he'd barely noticed the kids had been destroyed that first day, when the twins contracted a stomach virus and Carlo began sneezing violently. Since then, Sean had stepped on enough Legos to give him permanent marks on the bottoms of his feet, and he'd witnessed several meltdowns over bedtime and a food fight between Carlo and the twins that rivaled anything in the movie Animal House. Hence, the reason he was up early that Sunday morning, anxiously searching the listings for apartments he could afford, which were frighteningly scarce. Cheap real estate in the city was always next to impossible to find, and the fact that he was out on the island and couldn't just hop into a cab or the subway to rush to a potentially perfect apartment was frustrating. Decent places moved quickly, and sometimes you could arrive at an open house only to be told it was no longer available mere hours after the listing went up. It was looking more and more like he might have to live out here in the suburbs longer than anticipated. He loved his sister, he really did, but had no desire to live with her and her noisy brood. Plus, his job at Do Re Mi, the kitschy theme restaurant in Times Square, was on thin ice. Bruno, the manager, made his life miserable, but until he could find something else or win the lottery, he'd have to put up with Bruno's leering and sexual innuendos. He could tolerate the occasional squeeze of his ass because the tips were awesome and it was his place to shine. As a singing waiter, he took requests, but he also got to call on his own repertoire of songs from his high school musical days. Singing was one of the joys in his life that belonged only to him, and knowing he had customers who came regularly to hear him perform gave him the strength to ignore Bruno's nasty comments about how easily replaceable he was. Except now he not only had no place to live, but he might not have that job soon either, which scared him more than not having a roof over his head. He was sure he'd find a friend willing to put him up if need be, but a job wasn't so easy to find.